So here to present today on the changing standards for Michigan stormwater are Brad Boomstra, Kara Decker, and Dr. Hoeksema. Brad Boomstra is a licensed professional engineer specializing in project management, design, and construction management of water resource and environmental engineering projects, and works as a senior engineer for the Kent County Drain Commission and Administration. Brad is chair of the LGROW Stormwater Ordinance Committee. Kara Decker is an environmental engineer at the Grand Valley Metro Council, who also works with the LGROW communities in West Michigan to coordinate their NPDES stormwater programs and to promote community education and sustainable use of the Grand River and its watersheds. Dr. Hoeksema is a professor at Calvin College and a civil engineer with interest in hydraulics, hydrology, and water resources. He has done research applying geostatistical techniques to estimation problems in the subsurface. This work has been done for Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the Netherlands Institute of Applied Geosciences, TNO. He has also taught short courses in applied geostatistics and International Groundwater Modeling Center located at the Colorado School of Mines. He currently provides professional services for Fishbeck. And now, without any further ado, I'll give you the presentation.
Okay. All right, good afternoon. Thanks, James. And thank you to ASCE for having us here this afternoon. I know that there was some programming that got shifted around, so I really appreciate all of you being here today and participating in this discussion about the new stormwater standards. So like James said, I work for Grand Valley Metro Council. I help coordinate the 23 different communities that have MS4 permits in the region. I work with Brad, who's at the drain office, and then we've relied on Bob and his work at Fishbeck to develop the tool that we're going to be talking about today. So what's going to happen is I'm going to kind of give a brief big picture overview of stormwater standards, and then Brad's going to get into the more fun technical details of those standards, and then we'll have some questions, but we really want to save most of the time this afternoon to allow Bob to explain this new tool. I did also want to mention that this presentation is being recorded, so if some of your colleagues, weren't able to make it today, they'll be able to see this at a later date. All right, so I wanted to take a step back, make sure that we're all on the same page when talking about stormwater regulations. So in West Michigan, when it rains or when it snows, like today and that snow melts, all of that runoff flows over our impervious surfaces, enters a storm drain or some other sort of stormwater infrastructure, and then goes directly to our local lakes, rivers, and streams. It doesn't go to a treatment plant. So that means that our communities that own or operate a separate storm sewer have some extra regulations to follow in order to make sure that that water isn't polluted and impairing our local waterways. So at the federal level, these regulations come from the Clean Water Act, and locally, those are implemented through the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, or EGLE. In our area, we have Phase 1 and Phase 2 communities, which are really just based on population. So the city of Grand Rapids is a Phase 1 community because they have that many people that live in the city. All of our other communities are Phase 2. It just means that cities with larger populations have even more stringent regulations to follow. So this is a map of West Michigan. At Metro Council, we work with the communities that are in that light green shaded area. There are 23 different communities that are composed of school districts, villages, townships at the county level. And then I also wanted to bring in the Lake Macatawa watershed, which is that purple outline, because similar work is coming through the Macatawa Area Coordinating Council. So we have like the City of Holland, City of Zeeland, some of the work for Ottawa County, and then Allegan County also. And it's worth putting all of these guys on the same map because when we're talking about these stormwater standards today, they apply across the entire region. So the standards are applied throughout all these communities. Today though, when you're asking us questions and when Brad and I are talking, we're specifically talking about the standards in the Lower Grand River watershed. So communities in the Lower Grand River watershed have been working on a regional scale for a really long time. The current stormwater permits that we're working under were actually issued in 2003. The permit expired in 2008. We're still working under that 2003 permit. The permit reapplication to the state was due like 2015, 2016, and it's taken from that time until now to come through negotiations with the agency and get something that the communities and the agency are happy with. So the biggest changes in the new permits that we're expecting are going to be that total maximum daily load pollutants are going to be assigned. So in our watershed, we're talking about E. coli and biota, which will be measured as TSS. And then the other big change, new requirement in these permits, relates to post-construction controls. So talking about this development and redevelopment in the area. That's what we're going to focus on today. And it's timely that we're talking about this here today because we're expecting the Kent County Drain Office to have a new stormwater permit as of January 1st. So the work on these post-construction controls, or this development and redevelopment standards, has been headed up by the Lower Grand River Organization of Watersheds, or LGRO, Stormwater Ordinance Committee. So I want to thank all of the members of that committee for their hard work on this. And they really developed the framework for this model ordinance. So the ordinance defines the stormwater standards, but the standards are really explained in the standards manual. Each community, each MS4 community that has a permit is going to be required to adopt a new stormwater ordinance once they're issued that permit. And so townships, if you default to a county drain office for review, the townships may be following these new standards also. So like I said, the ordinance references these site development rules or the standards manual. And this is what these documents look like. And they outline all of the engineering calculations and technical requirements to meet the new stormwater standards. There are some differences between community to community. So some community may have a certain watershed policy statement in order to protect a certain waterway that comes through their community. Also, each community got to choose which design storm they use in order to design for flood control. So I just want to make sure that if you are a consultant that is working with multiple different municipalities, you really need to pay attention to the details because there are some little nuances in these manuals that could be different. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Brad to talk about some of the technical specifics.
Thank you, Kara. Before I get into the weeds here a little bit, I wanted to introduce a few folks that were part of our committee. Looking over at the table over there, we have with us Ken Yonker, the County Drain Commissioner from our office. Ken. And next to him, Angie Levitas. Most of you may know her. She's going to be the one that's going to make sure you do this right. Also from our committee, I got a list here. I'm not sure if everyone's here. Scott Connors is in the back from Walker. Rachel from Walker, right here. Tim Bradshaw from Kentwood. Wendy Ogilvie with Metro Council. Dan Tabor, City of Grand Rapids. Carrie Rivette was also involved. I don't think that she's here. Steve Oosting from Prine and Newhoff has been helping us. He works or does reviews for the city of Rockford, and they've been actually, I think, on one site, right, Steve? You've implemented the new rules. Myron Erickson from Wyoming. Is Myron here? I don't see him. Also, Rick Soleil over on the side. Jim Beakey's also been involved in some of these, and there may be some I've missed. So that's the committee, and we've been working for quite a while on this to get this going. So the other thing I did earlier, I don't know, a few weeks ago or whatever, I sent out an email to everyone I could find in my contact list that attached information on the public comment period that we just went through with Eagle on the new standards. So hopefully you got that. I also emailed out the actual design spreadsheet and the sample that goes with that. At the end here, when we get to the question page, my email address is up there, so if you want to get that stuff, if there's any updates, just send me an email so I have your information. So I just wanted to, before Bob gets up here, talk about the two big changes that are coming, and most of you may have already been familiar with this, but there's two pieces that are being added. The flood control piece is really not changing. So as we've done flood control before, that will remain. But the two things that are being added is first the water quality, and that deals with the total suspended solids, and the requirement is an 80% reduction in total suspended solids. Treats the first inch of rain, and that's the runoff from the first inch of rain. So there's a difference between those two. The way that's going to be accomplished is by implementing the green infrastructure stuff. So here's a few examples up on the slide. There's all sorts of things. And to accomplish the reduction in the suspended solids, if you look in the manual, there's certain percentage reductions for each BMP that's used. So we're going to rely on those and the manufacturer specifications when you install those to get up to that 80%. And that is built into the tool as well. Correct, Bob? The second piece is the channel protection piece. And so while we've done a good job at reducing peak flows in the past down to pre-development levels, we're now going to be required to reduce volume of runoff. And so this is going to have to be done up to the 2-year 24-hour rainfall event. That number for our area from Atlas 14 is 2.56 inches. So you'll have to run the existing condition and the proposed condition and deal with that difference in runoff volume. One of the main ways to do that is through infiltration. Obviously that doesn't work everywhere. I'm going to get into a little bit of a flow chart that we have on the next page. But the main piece is going to be through infiltration to try and deal with that. This is a flow chart. Is this in the manual? Yeah, this is in the manual. I'm not going to get into it too much, but basically it's a decision matrix that you're going to go through with your site to try and, what we don't want you to do is get through this and just automatically go to the alternative approach that we've developed, which is what everybody's going to want to do, I'm sure. So we've tried to make it hard to get there. So you're going to have to go through the detailed work to convince us that the alternative approach may be the only option. And when this first came out, I should mention there was no alternative approach, and it didn't look like any alternative approach was going to be approved. So I was down in Lansing a couple times with others discussing this with, at the time, DEQ and Eagle, to even get this alternative approach accepted and implemented. And what that is basically is extended detention, or really, really slow release rate. Now, that's going to be challenging in and of itself because we're going to have small outlets and the maintenance and whatnot that goes with that. So that's a whole nother issue that we're going to have to deal with. But at least we do have an alternative approach for these sites where either infiltration isn't possible because of heavy soils, or maybe there's high groundwater, or maybe there's some other issues that we'd have to deal with. So this spreadsheet just kind of leads you through a decision matrix to get to that alternative approach. That's an introduction to kind of the changes that are made. I guess on this last sheet, I'd like to, if any of us can answer any questions, I guess generally in terms of the manual itself. Is there any folks here that are using the manual yet, besides Steve? So maybe. I wanted to mention that our schedule for this, we are looking to implement this the first of the year. So you'd have to hurry and get Angie your developments this month if you want to get in front of that. And she's on vacation for the rest of the month, so. I guess we'll handle any questions that you have, and I decided, since I saw my nephew here, that he's going to answer all the questions. He's an engineering student, so. No. If you have any general questions, we can try and answer them now. Or else I'll turn it over to Bob. We're gonna, yeah, besides the spreadsheet stuff.
I'd like to compliment you on putting an edited date on that, so if it's reproduced later, you'll know what you're looking for.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and he's going to go through the spreadsheet.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about the Elgro design spreadsheet. So this is a project that there's a history to this spreadsheet, and I think it's like about 10 years old or older than that, something on that order. But over the last couple of years, we've been developing this for Grand Valley Metro Council, and we meaning Claire Schwartz and I at Fishbeck. This spreadsheet, it will be tailored to meet the specific requirements of each of the MS4 permittees, so we can put in the different variations that might exist between communities. The Kent County version, I don't know if you knew this, Brad, but it's available on a website. Yeah, good. I've got the link up here. So if you want to get a copy of this spreadsheet, you can do that. And so the URL is up there, and you'll see it 2 more times in this presentation if you don't get a chance to write it down now. So it's www.elgro.org/ms4. Along with the actual spreadsheet is a tutorial, 10-page long Word or 10-page long PDF document that goes through a site example and the filled out spreadsheet associated with that tutorial. So there's a lot of information available to learn from on that site. So what's the purpose of this spreadsheet? First of all, to document some of the site characteristics, some of the information that's needed for the site plan reviews. And the big part is to calculate some of these key quantities following the methodologies outlined in the new standards. In particular, the channel protection volume, the extended detention volume that is associated with the alternative approach, the water quality volume, TSS removal efficiency, and flood protection volumes. The spreadsheet does not do detailed BMP design. It's really there to say these are the volumes, and then once you've done the design, you can document that within the spreadsheet so that you can show that the design meets the standards. So it does provide a way for submitting the calculations for review, and hopefully that will simplify the review process. One of the concerns that's always raised with a tool like this is I put in numbers and I get out results. How do I know they're right? Okay, how do I know they're accurate? What are the equations behind all of the, this tool? And when we open up a spreadsheet, we like to look for the equations. That might be hard to do. It's a fairly complex spreadsheet just because it's got to handle a lot of different conditions, a lot of different cases, and it would be very difficult to track down the key calculations. So we've provided some other ways to validate, verify the numbers that you get. First of all, every calculation that's done in the spreadsheet is outlined in the Stormwater Standards Manual. There's a documentation tab in the spreadsheet itself that you can go to find the equations. When you get to certain points within the spreadsheet where you have to make some decisions, there are some internal notes that you hover over and you see, and that will help with the decisions. And again, as I mentioned before, there's the tutorial, and so I do recommend, that as you start into this thing, look over the tutorial, look over the results there. Another thing I always suggest is just take a simple case study and try it, where you can easily make the calculations. So use a simple case to test the calculations. So there are a lot of ways to get guidance and to do some sort of validation. One of the major changes that occurred over the last, I think it was about a year ago that we decided to implement a fairly sizable change to this thing, was that we introduced sub-catchments within the spreadsheet. Okay, so a given site might have some distributed BMPs that handle channel protection, which is associated with a 2-year rain event, or associated with water quality, which is the 1-inch rain event. But then larger events will eventually discharge to a flood control detention or retention pond. So one spreadsheet would be used for all areas that drain to a single detention or retention pond for flood control. And then the subcatchments within that would be areas that drain to individual BMPs or to the area just surrounding the detention pond. So you would first have to take the site and split it up into various subcatchments to use the spreadsheet. So this is the case study. This is, I'm going to run through a numerical example later on, but it's not for this one. But this is the one that's in the tutorial. And this is a little bit more complex than what I'm going to attempt to do today. So in this particular example, we have a site with parking lot and some roofs, a vegetated roof, some single-family homes, streets. And so in the case study for the tutorial, this was subdivided into 6 subcatchments, 6 separate areas. So sub 1 is on the upper left, where you have some grassy areas and a parking lot, which is draining to a rain garden with a vegetated filter strip for pre-treatment. That then eventually discharges to the detention pond via a storm sewer. Sub 2 is a vegetated roof, and any overflow from the vegetated roof discharges to sub 3. Sub 3 is a roof and pervious pavement, a small area of impervious that discharges to a minimal disturbed area, and so these are all pieces of this process, and that eventually goes by way of storm sewer over to the detention pond. Sub 4 are their single family homes, and the runoff from there is treated with a bioswale. Sub 5 is just a road, which eventually drains through catch basins and onto the detention pond. So the first step would be to take the site and divide it up into these subcatchments. And it may be just 2 subcatchments, or it may be hopefully no more than 10, because that's all that you can do in the spreadsheet. So there's a limit. So that's really the first thing to understand, is that there are subcatchments essentially defined by the BMPs. So getting a little closer to actually bringing up the spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet has 15 visible tabs, which means there are some that are not visible. And I think that number is something like 10. So there's a summary tab where you put in some preliminary information and you get some results out related to channel protection and water quality. Then each subcatchment has its own tab, and so they're called sub 1 through sub 10. And if you only have 2, you're going to use 2. And if you need 11, that's a problem. Then for flood control, one of the ways to calculate flood control is by routing a hydrograph through a detention pond. And so there's a tab for calculating time of concentration if you need that. Then there's a flood control tab where you can then look at the flood control volumes and some additional summary information. And then there's a documentation tab and then a settings tab. And the settings tab is where you'll find some of the local community information. So hopefully this will work properly. There it is. Did it all fit on? No, it didn't. Let's see, we see column C. It's pretty close. I think I'm going to avoid trying to, well, I can bring it in just a bit here. want to make sure everybody can see most of it. Okay, that's good. If we get column B, that's great. So this is the summary tab, and so it has some disclaimers at the top, and you see this is the design spreadsheet for municipality of XYZ. Somewhere in Kent County is XYZ, I'm not sure, but so if this is for the city of Kentwood, that version would have City of Kentwood on the top. So this is the site summary page, and all of the yellow cells are where you type in information. Some of the green cells are pull downs, and there are check boxes. So you put in some information about the developer, location, address, and so forth. And there are a number of things here. You can see when I hover over a drainage district, it says indicate whether site is located within a county drain district or a municipal stormwater district and provide name. So that's just some of the information that has to be provided for the site. Is there a watershed policy? Is this a redevelopment? And so forth. Then there's a place where you can identify some of the sensitive areas. So water bodies, rivers and streams, floodplains, riparian areas, wetlands, woodlands, sand dunes, and so forth. So this next panel is about the pre-development land use definition. So one of the questions is, what do we mean by pre-development? Is it existing before any construction is done, or is it pre-settlement? And some communities may select pre-settlement, some communities may select existing. And so the pull down here allows me to choose existing or pre-settlement, but a community's version could be locked down, so you only have one choice. You have two different things you can select, but it's the same name. So that's where somebody might select existing or pre-settlement if that's an option. So this has to do with channel protection volume not required. So you would click that and put it in a note. Here's the fun part. So those of you who enjoy doing some spreadsheet programming, I guess my students know that I like to do that. This was the more interesting challenge here. You might have a half a dozen sub-catchments, but we also have to identify which drains to which. In other words, what's the connectivity between the sub-catchments? Because if there's unmet channel protection volume in one, it may be met in the next one downstream. Okay, and so the spreadsheet accounts for that, so it has to know what sub-catchments are downstream from other sub-catchments. So the process is easy, I think. Kara has tried it and she agrees. Yeah. So basically you specify the number of sub-catchments, let's say 6. And then all of a sudden the title here says select 6. Here are the sub-catchment names, and basically what you have to do is go upstream to downstream. And again, all this information is in the hovering notes. You go upstream to downstream, selecting which sub-catchment is downstream from that one. Okay? So let's say sub-catchment has sub-catchment 4 downstream. Sub 2 might also have 4 downstream. Maybe sub 3 has sub-catchment 4 downstream. And then sub-catchment 4, I can't pick itself, right? So maybe that's 5 downstream from it. 5 might have 6. And then finally 6 drains to none because it's the last one. So you can set up just about any kind of connectivity. The key is start upstream, work downstream, and if you make a mistake, just delete them all and start over again. It's not too hard. So that will take a little bit getting used to, but as I go further down, these are areas that will be populated once we start populating the information in the subcatchments. And we'll get back to this when I'll bring up a spreadsheet that has some data filled in already. So then the subcatchments, and I'm going to just go through these quickly because, again, I'm going to do an example in a minute. You specify the runoff information, land use, soil type. Then you've got a place where you can specify how you're going to meet the channel protection volume. Then you have a place where you can find out what the water quality volume is going to be. And then an area where we can do the TSS accounting. That's the scary part. And so there's one of those for every one of the subcatchments. Let me go over to time of concentration. In the spreadsheet, when you're doing flood control, you can either specify your own time of concentration or use this tab to calculate it. And this is basically standard TR55 time of concentration calculator. And then the flood control tab, at the top of that is where you say, am I going to specify the time of concentration or am I going to let the worksheet do it? And if I specify it, I can put in numbers here to give my own value for time of concentration. Once I have that, it will calculate the required storage volume for flood control or for a retention basin. Okay, and for flood control, there's actually a little button that has to be pushed because it goes through an iterative process calculating the size of the detention basin to get the correct peak discharge. Okay, so we'll see that work in a little bit. There's a documentation tab, and here are where all the equations are. And you can pretty much use that to check all of the calculations for a very simple case, with the only exception being the flood control volume for detention. That one is a little harder to check because that's much more complex. Then we have a settings page, and this is where we have our municipality of XYZ, and maybe that's going to be City of Grand Rapids or Kent County. Here's where the local municipality can choose whether the volume the channel protection volume bases is, let's get the little button here, existing or pre-settlement or selectable, user selectable. Same thing for the flood control event. Is it 25-year, 100-year, or user selectable? Information about the peak discharge limit for detention, flood control, rainfall information, and then precipitation data. So this page would be locked down by Grand Valley Metro Council and set up for each individual community. Okay, let me go back to the PowerPoint. So I wanted to talk just in a little bit more detail about the calculations being made. On the tables, I have about three or four copies of the next 4 slides. So if you want to have that to look at, you can. So first of all, channel protection. Channel protection consists of retaining on site the net increase in runoff volume between pre-development and post-development conditions for a 2-year, 24-hour storm using the runoff curve number method. So 2-year storm, 2-year, 24-hour storm, curve number approach, calculate the existing or the pre-development runoff volume, calculate the post-development runoff volume, and the difference is the amount that has to be retained on site using retentive BMPs. So each subcatchment will be split into combinations of land use and soil type, and then the runoff volume will be calculated, and then that difference will be shown as what has to be retained on site. The calculations are pretty straightforward, 2 equations. S, potential maximum retention, 1,000 over the curve number minus 10. QV is the depth of surface runoff based on the precipitation depth in S. Okay. The water quality volume is treatment of the runoff generated from 1 inch of rain over the developed portion of the site using the small storm hydrology method. Basically, it's a rational method approach where the volume is simply area times the runoff coefficient times 1 inch times a factor to convert units. And there are just 6 coefficients that are being used, 3 for directly connected impervious areas and 3 for disturbed pervious areas. And so the spreadsheet will select the right ones and make that calculation for you. The challenge here, Brad talked about it a little bit, was the goal is to get 80% reduction in TSS through the various BMPs, and the issue is that some of these BMPs are retentive. They retain a certain volume and treatment is done on that volume retained. And some of them are passed through, where water is passing through the system, maybe an underdrained device of some sort. And so it's not retaining the water, but it's passing it through. But if it's designed properly, everything that passes through is being treated. And so we had to think very carefully about how to do that calculation for these 2 different kinds of BMPs. And this is flood control. This is the part that really hasn't changed much. The one thing to note is that there are a number of methods that are outlined in the standards, but the spreadsheet only uses uses 1 for detention and 1 for retention. So for detention, basically it's routing an inflow hydrograph through a detention pond to get specified peak discharge on the outflow. The advantage of what's programmed into the spreadsheet is that on the inflow hydrograph into the detention pond, it accounts for the retention storage upstream. So it gives you that sort of advantage. Okay, so it accounts for all of the other retention storage on site. And again, it can be set up for, it is set up right now for a 0.13 CFS per acre for a 25-year event. For retention, if you've got a retention basin as the flood control device, then it's simply the required volume is 85% of what gets to that retention pond. Okay. Yeah, so there's, I wanted to do a very simple test case or demonstration case for this presentation. I don't even have a picture of a site. I didn't even want to think about that. I just wanted some numbers to throw in, right? So I've got 2 areas that are draining to a detention pond. The first area is 4 acres, all hydrologic soil group B soils. Areas 2 in the detention pond are each 1 acre with very heavy soils, so hydrologic soil group D. The existing condition for all areas is open space fair condition, and these are things right out of the CN number table. Area 1, when it's developed, we have 1 acre of flat roof, acre and a half of parking, half an acre of native revegetation, 1 acre of open space with a rain garden with a filter strip. And the rain garden here is going to be sized for the entire channel protection volume. Area 2, since it is type D soil, we'll assume the alternative approach of extended detention. And so this is going to be half acre of paved, half acre of open and good condition, no channel protection due to poor soils, but some treatment of that of the TSS just by the fact that we have properly designed catch basins. And then there's the subcatchment for the detention pond. So let's take a look at the spreadsheet again. Yes, there it is. Let me move it over just a bit. There we go. So my example site, and here you can see I've got 3 subcatchments. Sub 1 and sub 2 both drain to sub 3. Sub 3 is the last one, so it's a none, and they're named area 1, area 2, and detention. So let's go to sub 1, and so the name pops up here. And so now we have a pull down, and let me just bring this down a second here. And you can see that you can select any one of the standard items in a curve number table, right? Pasture, meadow, orchard, everything else. And this, we're starting out as the existing land use as open spaces in fair condition. And there's a pull down to select the hydrologic soil group, A, B, C, or D, specify the area, and even specify the units. That was a confusing thing, acres or square feet. For the developed site, it gets a little bit more complicated because we have to identify between disturbed areas, areas, let me bring up the pull down. So we have disturbed areas of the site. So impervious, gravel, bare soil, disturbed that are now open spaces in poor, fair, or good condition. There are also what are called non-structural BMPs. Okay, so these are things that you can do for this part of this part of the site to minimize the amount of disturbance or to improve the characteristics of the site. So we've got minimal disturbance area. We can protect trees. There's protect natural flowways. There's native revegetation. And impervious with the stormwater disconnect, where the impervious area doesn't go into the storm sewer, but just is disconnected. And so these areas would then receive credit by way of curve numbers that result in less runoff, therefore smaller channel protection volumes. Then for the BMP surface itself, we've got 3 options. And then there may be some areas within a subcatchment that are just existing and aren't experiencing any change. So the whole list of land uses are there for existing condition possibility. So that gets a little bit more complicated when defining the developed site. So here we had 2.5 acres of pavement, roof, and then let's see, I had 1 acre of open and good condition, but I'm also including in that the rain garden, which is a structural BMP surface, and then a half acre of native revegetation. So each of these is specified, a curve number is calculated, runoff is calculated from that, okay? So here's the required channel protection volume. Again, it's the 2-year, 24-hour rain event, the runoff pre-development, the runoff post-development. So the developed runoff is 22,000, the pre-developed is 6,000, the difference is 15, and that's what has to be retained on site. If there was a subcatchment upstream of this and there was some unmet channel protection, that could be then sent down to this one. That's the whole challenge of the multiple subcatchments. So in this case, 15,645 cubic feet of channel protection is required, and it's going to be done with a bioretention rain garden. So I put in this number and kind of guessed. Well, it turned out to be pretty good right now. But I started with a different guess, right? So this is the area of the BMP. This is the available water volume, and you can see I have an equation in there connected to the area. So it's a half a foot of water on the surface plus 3 feet of soil with a porosity of about 0.3. So it calculates the volume of water based on the area. I have a design infiltration rate of 2.74 through the soil in the rain garden, which is based on the little calculator below, which I won't get into, but I can connect the 2.74 down to the value calculated below. And it gives you, I think it's 6 hours of infiltration as an additional volume. Okay, so that's how that's done. So the volume provided is 15,777. The volume needed is 15,645. I'm good. So I've kind of sized the rain garden for the particular needs. Then we get the water quality volume calculation, and again, this is 1 inch of rainfall. And so it's 2.5 impervious acres, 0.85 directly connected disturbed pervious acres, and initially assumes it's all paved unless I specify otherwise. So I had 1 acre of flat roof, means there's 1.5 acres of paved, and then that allows the calculation of 8665 cubic feet. For TSS, now this was sort of a challenge here. We didn't want to get into what's the concentration of total suspended solids in the stormwater. So and because we were only looking at percent reductions, we counted a unit of TSS, slide over a little bit here. A unit of TSS is the mass of TSS carried by 1 cubic foot of runoff. So I could track units of TSS, units of water volume, TSS reduction percentages, and then track that through the system. So in this case, we have 8665, that's the volume of water that has to be treated for 80% TSS reduction. And here's my TSS number. So in this case, I have a vegetated filter strip as pre-treatment to the rain garden, which is passing the entire water quality volume and treating it at 50%. And that's a value that's in a table in the back of this thing. So as soon as I specify, let's say I specify a bioswale here, it picks up the TSS removal efficiency from a table in the spreadsheet, and those tables are also in the guide. And then the bioretention rain garden is only treating that volume that's retained in it. So that 515.777 goes up to the earlier part of this page where you have the volume of the rain garden. So it calculates the volume, the TSS removed, the TSS removal efficiency. That's sub 1. Similar for sub 2. Let me go through this more quickly, hopefully. Sub 2, we have D-type soils. We have about 1,700 cubic feet of channel protection volume, which can't be met by any retentive BMPs because we're in type D soils, so I've got nothing listed there. So nothing is treated. It does generate water quality volume. But I do have some catch basins for treating the TSS, which have about 22% removal efficiency if they're designed correctly according to the standards. And so we can calculate the removal of TSS even in that case. Sub 3 is the detention pond. Again, existing, developed is BMP surface. Because it's just the area around the detention pond, I don't have to provide channel protection volume, so I can turn it off with a no there. So it's not generating any more of that. In the water quality volume, it's not generating any new water quality volume requirements, but I still have some being carried over from that second area, okay? And so I can look at the treatment of TSS through a sediment forebay and a detention pond to get the final TSS removal efficiency. Okay, jumping over to flood control. So in this case, I'm using a user-specified time of concentration, which I put in at a half hour, just to keep this simple. And right now it has calculated a required storage volume of 35,000 cubic feet for the 25-year event. Let's say there is a way to change this if you have an alternative discharge, and there are some reasons for doing that outlined in the standards. Let me just put in a number of 0.5. Then all of a sudden the button says, press button to calculate, because the number is 0 and that's not right. So if I press this button, There it is. And so that would be the required storage volume for a 0.5 CFS peak discharge. If I go back to the 0.78 and hit the button again, it calculates the volume needed to get the 0.78 cubic feet per CFS per acre peak discharge. And then below this, we got some nice pretty hydrograph pictures and a more complete table giving runoff, peak discharge runoff volumes for 1, 2, 10, 25, 100-year events. And the disclaimer, which is important. So that's the spreadsheet. I know it's a lot to take in at this point, but that's the tool that's available for the new standards. And so we will take questions. Brad, Kara.
Oh, thank you. How is this going to impact Lake Michigan water levels?
Not at all.
It's not going to hurt them.
Shouldn't. It should make the water cleaner. And, I mean, the intent of the channel protection volume is to retain water inside.
So I guess we didn't really get into the nitty-gritty requirements of this, but these standards are going to apply to all developments and redevelopments that are equal to or greater than 1 acre in size. So keep that in mind when you're designing your sites. Like we said, Kent County, we're expecting that the drain office will have their permit January 1st, and then all of the other MS4 communities in the area will kind of roll out shortly after that.
Thanks for coming and bear with us as we work through this thing. So.
Is there any other questions?
I guess, just real quick from the city of Grand Rapids perspective, I'd like to thank Outdoor for all the work we've done. Our time frame is more tied to getting our MS4 permit with Eagle. So we're kind of like more anticipating a year and a half time frame. We're going to do like a public education deal like they're doing, so developers, owners, and whatnot will be notified of the implementation. Myself and Kara have spent some time with this spreadsheet. My advice to you is open it and try it. It's a learning curve, it's intuitive. I mean, all those engineers are like, oh, it's just a spreadsheet. Spend some time with it, get familiar with what some of the information they're asking, things you'll want, you know, new grad engineers to start looking up soil types and things like that, and things to tell your surveyors, and it's different. It's a different design animal. You just gotta get comfortable with it. So I advise strongly to open it up and spend some time.
You're not required to use a spreadsheet. You can do all these calculations by hand, but we developed this tool to make it a little bit easier.
Is there a limitation on maximum drainage area to use that sheet, or is there a minimum or a maximum?
Really, the only limitation is number of subcatchments.
So drain commissions starts with these rules on the first. The city is maybe a year or two out. What about the other communities?
As Eagle gets to them.
They're all on an individual community basis.
Right, right, yep. So each community will have to go through a 30-day public comment period, which is what the drain office just came through.
Okay.
So we're still waiting for Eagle to get a hold of us to have all these other communities go through that 30-day notice period. I anticipate it will be soon after January 1st, and multiple communities at a time. Yeah, so I guess that's a good point, Bob. So when are the standards going to be available? So we have that Outro spreadsheet online right now. I'm not going to post the design standards or the county site development rules until we get the final sign off from Eagle. So January 1st, you'll see those. And there is the model ordinance. I kind of flashed the cover of that. That is already on the Kent County Drain Office's website.
Is this a precursor to when you have to remove chemicals from the water?
Possibly.
Ask Eagle.
The last update from Eagle that they gave last week was that maybe they would tie some sort of environmental sampling, especially when we're talking about road salts, different chemicals involved in road salts, maybe, but down the road, not with this permitting cycle.
Yeah, just look at your accident map this morning when you get rid of road salt.
We appreciate all of your time today. We'll be hanging out if you have any other questions, but thank you.